Khashab. She is a accredited genealogist. She specializes in Hispanic genealogy, especially today. She's going to be talking with us about Spanish colonial and Mexican records. If you don't have a handout, be sure you get one. It provides a tremendous amount of information on locating people, whether they're your ancestors or not, in Spanish colonial America. And I also want to mention that she is currently immediate past president of the Dallas Genealogical Society and a member of, is it HOGAR? Does it go by HOGAR?
Oh, yes, yes, HOGAR.
Hispanic
Organization
for Genealogy and Research.
Yes.
Yes. So you might be interested in what that group does as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Khashab.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's very nice to be here. Although we don't have a big crowd, it's okay. I'm used to giving short little history seminars with a very small amount of people, and we'll just be a little bit more informal than usual. Okay, let's start with me and my name, which you can see up there is Janet Khashab. I would like to tell all of you that this is the last part is my husband's name. It's not my name, and this all comes from the horrible Anglo-American problem of always changing the woman's name to match with her husband's. My maiden name was Paulus, which is also not Hispanic, but my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was a Castaño. And she was from Mexico, and she came from a small town just across the Rio Grande. And actually a quite well-known town, it's Lampasas, near Monterrey. It is famous for its very active population of men who were very well known in the history of Mexico. I will mention sometimes my relatives, and they are all through my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. The AG means an accredited genealogist. That means that I went through this very long process of getting my accreditation. I had to apply by doing a 4-generation report, and if they approved the report, then I had to take an exam, which took all day. I had to go to Salt Lake City to take this exam. And it was a very long process, and it took me almost 2 years to complete it. This was 5 years ago. And I think it's even longer now, so I'm happy I did it 5 years ago and not now. The people that give the accreditation are called ICAP Gen, and you can find them on the internet if you're interested in becoming accredited yourself. They have different areas of accreditation, not just Mexico, but all over the world. So you might look at them and see. ICAP, no, I didn't put on my handout. No, because it's pretty easy. It's I and then CAP, ICAP Gen, Gen, ICAP Gen. And you can or you can look up accredited genealogist on Google, and Google will get you there too. Okay. Let's talk about Hispanic Texas and genealogical Stewpot. Now, my task is to present a very complex subject that lasted 300 years within an hour time limit. Okay, now in order to do that, I'm going to concentrate on history, people, and culture, and less on the genealogical source material. This list I've given you is in your handout, and I think that it's pretty extensive. But I don't believe that a genealogical source is very useful unless the researcher has a firm understanding of the people who created that source or that record. That's what I'm going to try to give to you now. Now, I've subtitled this talk A Genealogical Stewpot because Texas is something like the old campfire stewpot, which there was boiling water, and whoever had something, they dropped it in, you know, onions, chili pepper, possum, raccoon, whatever. And they boiled it up. Okay. Now, in the same way, Hispanic Texas is not just Spanish, but was made up of a large variety of people. Native Americans, African Americans, Middle Easterners, and other Europeans. And soon the population was also mixed and blended, just like that old stew. Now, when I was growing up in Garland, and I did grow up in Garland, Texas, just northeast of Dallas, in the 50s, I was convinced that I lived on the edge of civilization. My dad would take us fishing, and we'd go long fishing trips, and we'd go to Texoma and Garza Little Elm or Possum Kingdom, which is a bit far. And I was sure that if you went too far north or west, you would fall off the earth. Okay. Although I didn't know it at the time, I shared this idea of Texas as a big empty space with many people who came to this area before. But in fact, 15,000 years ago, there were people in Texas. And there were 4 main groups. The first group, which is probably the one that you are most familiar with, is the Apaches, or the related tribes of the Apaches. These are, of course, the nomadic people who very famously went around taking down their teepees and going after the buffalo. They were the hunters, gatherer people. The second group are the Caddo and their related tribes who were in southeast Texas. As you can see over there in this yellow corner, this is with the Caddo. And they were semi-settled agriculturists and traders. They were very well known for trading among all the other tribes. These are their houses, which were kind of conical shape. I don't know how many of you have been to Oklahoma, to the Indian village, but they have a very, very good reproduction of this house. And to go inside of it is like returning to the womb of the mother. It is a fantastic experience when it is conical and it goes up and there's a light that comes from the top. It's a very, very moving experience. If you have a chance, they have all types of housing that they have rebuilt in Indian Village. The third type were the the hunter-gatherers, and these simply had sticks, and they gathered brush, and they put their house together. They lived in the coastal area, the south coastal area. As you can see from this, they're kind of orangey colored here. And the last group were, of course, the Pueblo Indian group. In Texas, they were settled and semi-settled people. They built pueblos, and there were in Texas pueblos, just like there were up in New Mexico. They were not built as well, and they didn't last as long, but they were there. These people were known as Humano or Jumano. Now, how do we know about these people? Well, there's only 2 methods of learning about, because they were not literate. They did not have a writing system that we have ever found. So to find out about these people, you would have to either go to archaeology, and they have done a fantastic job of archaeology in Texas, and this is the website Texas Beyond History, and it does a marvelous job of going to the Indian archaeological sites, the French, and the Spanish. So we know a lot of history from the archaeology. The other reason we know about the Indians, of course, was because the Spanish and the English came to the Americas. And this particular slide shows you the 2 routes and the 2 areas that the English and the Spanish took. And you can see the darker lines here. Do you see how much interior exploration that the Spanish did in contrast to the English? Now, there was a reason why the English called the part that they went to New England, and a reason why the Spanish called the area that they went to New Spain. They didn't call it something else. That's what they called it. Now I want you to look at this slide, if I can get it up. All right. You see all these slides, A, B, C, D, E, F? Okay, there were 2 photos that were taken in Andalusia, Spain. The rest were taken in Texas. And one in New Mexico, actually. Okay, can anybody give a guess as to which 2 were taken in Andalusia? Really difficult, huh? It's C and D. C and D. If you've been to Andalusia, you know what I'm talking about. A is the Rio Grande Valley. B is the Texas Hill Country. E, let's see, no, yes, C and D. E is Santa Fe. And F is East Texas. All right, now East Texas stands out from all of those. And it stood out in New Spain also. It's when you go east, you'll suddenly hit the piney woods. This was not a natural habitat for the Spanish. All right? It was a more natural habitat for the Northern Europeans. They knew what to do with all of those pieces of wood that you got from the tree besides just burn them. They knew how to make log cabins. They knew how to do this and that and the other. They knew what to do with the trees. The Spanish knew what to do with brick and how to make the bricks. So this is what they usually did, unless they just made a very primitive type of building with twigs and thatch or something like that. I'm going to tell you a lot about F. That is East Texas. I happen to have ancestors who were Hispanic, who had lived in East Texas from the 1700s. So I'm going to mention them. Now, let's look at the explorers, and I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can so that you would understand. It is very important that you understand the explorers and how they influenced people who came after them. Now, they wandered around all over the Southwest. And one of the most famous, of course, is De Soto, which is his big picture here. And it has this idealistic picture of him marching in there with all his troops. And here are the Indians, you know, who are in awe and trembling about it. This was not exactly true. He did march in there. He was starving. They didn't have anything to eat. They tried bartering. If that didn't work, they tried killing to get what they needed. Finally, De Soto happened to get sick and did die, and they were afraid that the Indians might find out that he is dead, so that they buried him very near the Mississippi River. This left his compatriot and his second in command, Moscoso, who traveled down into East Texas and wandered around a little bit. Then he retraced his steps and went back. And finally, there was, I don't know how many, finally managed to come back to Spain, but it wasn't very many. Now, let's see if we can get this. The most famous, though, is not De Soto or his second in command for wandering around Texas. That was Cabeza de Vaca. And he came in 1528. And he lived among the Indians for 7 years before he finally found his way back to the Spanish who had conquered Mexico. Now, just after de Vaca, he wrote a book which was very, very influential. After him were I have to remember to do this. This is Moscoso running all over the place. Over there under Granada, Granada started a very well-planned expedition into the whole southwestern part of America. into Texas, into up to California, not to California, but up to Nevada, Kansas, the panhandle of Texas. It was very well planned and very well orchestrated. He had his people go out ahead of time. They made base camps. They went out just like you would do an expedition to the South Pole. That's how this was organized. He came back a little bit disappointed that he hadn't found any gold or any big civilization like they had found in Mexico City. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about Cabeza de Vaca. And the reason is because his journey and the book that he wrote was unbelievably important for the history of Texas. And you think now, why would that, how would this person who was coming over here in 1528, how could he influence? Well, he did. He started off, and you can see it in the map, they started off in his expedition from Hispaniola, which is the island, as you can see over there, in the Bahamas. And they started the expedition and went to Florida. When they got to Florida, they started to do the interior and went around. The person who was the leader of the expedition was very incompetent, didn't have enough food with him, didn't know how to approach the natives for water or whatever it was. A lot of them were killed. They tried going around. They had a shipwreck. They lost all their ships. They wandered all along the coast, the upper coast. And finally, they killed their horses, chopped down some trees, and made some rafts. There came a big storm, and about, let's see if we can get this up, about 80 survivors from a group which was about 300, 400 men. Only 80 survivors managed to wash up on Galveston Beach. And some of these were resorted to being cannibals and eating their fellow Spaniards to survive. De Vaca was taken over by a tribe which wandered all over South Texas. They were in Galveston when there was fish running. They went inward when the pecans were ripe. They went even down in where there was a desert, and they went and ate the cactus. They were hunter-gatherers, and that's what they did. And he had a very tough life living with them. But he became a trader with them. They were also traders, and they went all with the different Indians, and he learned to speak the language that they spoke. Later, he met some other survivors, and these were 2 other Spaniards, and one of them had a black slave with him. Now, the route that they followed, they decided to leave and try to go back to Mexico. They knew that Mexico was there. They'd heard the stories already that there were other white men in Texas or near Texas. So they decided to see if they could find them. Now, what is the route that he took back to Mexico was a big controversy, and the Texas Historical, Southwestern Texas Historical, the Southwestern Historical Quarterly, excuse me, had a lot of articles about which way he took. And these, if you can see the blue and the green, this was the favored route of everyone who said, yes, he had to come through Central Texas. And these were people who had a hidden agenda, I think, because they lived in Austin or San Antonio. He actually didn't go there. He actually, if you follow his journal very carefully, you can map it. He went straight south. He got across the Rio Grande, and then the tribes, the Indians that he met, told him that it was too dangerous to go forward that direction. They said, the people that you want are to your west. So he turned and went northwest, and through the deserts and through, if you have ever been in that area, you can't believe how anybody had done this, but he did that. Then he got up to the top of the Rio Grande, and the tribes told him they were southwest. So he traveled southwest and he did find the other Spaniards. What he found was Spaniards who were along the Pacific coast enslaving the Indians so that they could use them in the silver mines. Anyway, when he got there, let me show you I'm having some troubles here. De Vaca was known not only, and the group that was with him, some of them were faith healers. Two of the men with him were faith healers, and they would say some words, usually a prayer in Spanish, and blow on the people, and the people felt better. You know, this was psychological. However, De Vaca got interested in surgery, and he actually did what was open heart surgery on one of the Indians who had been shot by an arrow. Not open heart, but he went next to the heart and took the arrow out. And so he is the patron saint of the surgeons of Texas. And they often put his name on there. Now, as he started to go closer to get to Mexico and where the Spanish were, he got a very big following of Indians. People wanted to go with him. They said, we have to protect you from them. From whom? From the Spanish. They were going to try to protect him. So they formed a very big group of people. And when they came close to the Spanish, De Vaca went over there and he saw one of the men, and he said, I remained and asked them, meaning the Spanish soldiers, to give me a certified statement of the date, year, month, and day when I had met them, and also the condition which I had come, and which this request they complied. De Vaca was a bureaucrat. He was on this particular expedition because he was a bureaucrat. He was a treasurer. He was supposed to take very good records of all that was spent from the original expedition. And you can see that the first thing he did, he meets his compatriots over there in the middle of nowhere. What does he ask them for? A certified copy of their meeting. He wanted to keep this because he has to put it all in his record. All right, now here's a picture or a drawing of De Vaca, and this is his famous book, which he wrote. And this is a formal report, and it's called La Región, La Comanteros, but it's popularly known as the Shipwrecks. Now, this made a great impression on the government of Spain and the religious circles, especially because De Vaca declared that the American Indians were receptive to Christianity and should be treated kindly. The Indians who accompanied De Vaca's group showed them the way to the Spanish soldiers who had made them suffer, the Indians suffer, the effects of enslavement. De Vaca told the Indians they must return to their village and put the crosses on their houses and carrying them when meeting such soldiers to avoid becoming slaves. The Indians promised to do as they were ordered and went away. This took place in the presence of a scribe, a notary, and a great many witnesses. When he told the Indians this, he made sure that it was witnessed. He made sure he had a scribe write it down. He made sure that it was a certified copy, if you like, of what happened. Well, he was good to do that because it wasn't that easy at putting crosses on the buildings to keep the soldiers from enslaving them. Now, if you're interested in this story, the Southwestern State University in San Marcos has a very comprehensive website about De Vaca and his influence, and it's on your handout. If you would like, you can read his account. It's over there. It's translated into English. They have the original, one of the original copies made, and they show that on their website. It is a really very, very informative website. Now, let's go on and get away from this a little bit. I want to look at the people who are in this narrative, because in many ways they mirror the influences that was the reality of Hispanic Texas. All right, let's look at the people in the narrative. There were 3 Spanish male survivors. There was the bureaucrat, and you know him, Alvaro Nunez, Cabeza de Vaca. There was the captain, who was Andres Dorantes de Carranza. And there was the impoverished nobleman, Alonso Castillo Maldonado. Maldonado, yeah, okay. Excuse my Spanish pronunciation. I was bilingual until I was 8, at which time I think we moved to Garland, and under the influence of many peers, I lost my bilingualism, and I had to learn it again when I got older, and it just doesn't come naturally to me, although I can read in Spanish. Now, the first one out of the 3 was Cabeza de Vaca, and he's the personification of the government bureaucrat, but he has a human face over this bureaucratic stance. And after returning to Spain, he was sent on another expedition to South America, where he was made the governor. His views on the relation with the native population made him unpopular with the Spanish settlers, and he was arrested and sent back to Spain, where he died some years later. It is not certain if he married or not, but he did not have any heirs, and we know this for sure. Andre Dorantes de Carranza was one of the captains of the ill-fated Florida expedition, and he brought his own slave with him, Esteban. After their adventures, he sold the slave to the Viceroy Mendoza in Mexico City. Dorantes tried to return to Spain, but the boat he was on was caught in a storm, and he turned back. He tried another boat, and the same thing happened. He decided it was his fate. He would never return to Spain. So he married in New Spain a succession of 2 wealthy widows who had landed estates. He had a total of 14 children. There is a compiled genealogy of his descendants, and has been published, and many people can claim descent from this man, which is amazing that they can claim descent from a man who wandered all over Texas in the 1500s. The other man was the impoverished nobleman, Alonso Castillo, and he also stayed in New Spain after trying to be a bureaucrat, but he came back to New Spain and married, but he had no male descendants. So his genealogy was not compiled. Most genealogies were compiled by male descendants only. Now let us look at the other people who are in this group. There was one black male slave, Estevanico, or Estevan. Estevanico is the pet name for Estevan, which is the Spanish for Stephen. He was the personal slave of Carranza. He was a native of the Atlantic side of Morocco, and though he's usually referred to as Negro or black, other people have described him as brown. He was most probably a Christian original native settler of Morocco. He probably was not Muslim. They were sometimes sold into slavery to the Spanish by the Muslims. So this is probably how he came into being a black slave in Texas. Now, after he was sold, he was sent on another expedition to New Mexico to find the Pueblo settlers there, but he was killed by the Indians in 1539. Estevan was the most well-known of the survivors among the Indians, because he was completely different from anything they had ever seen. He was even more talked about than were the white Europeans who had beards and blue eyes, I guess, and so on. But this was completely unusual for them, so he was very popular among the Indians. Now, there were, of course, a lot of nameless Native Americans, Indians in southern Texas and northern Mexico, which he met. De Vaca does not individualize or give any names for any of the Indians that he met. He reported their customs, their tribal affiliations, and their location. But apparently, or so he would make it seem, he did not engage in personal relations with them. Now, being a human being, we doubt that. But remember, the only report we have was a bureaucrat's report to the king. He's not going to tell you what he did or did not do personally while living with the Indians. There were the nameless Spanish soldiers who were under Diego de Guzman in Mexico. Diego was the nephew of Bloody Guzman, and he was the Spanish administrator of this area in New Spain, and he was arrested and sent back to Spain in chains in 1537 because of his blatant cruelty to the Indians. So you have to know that there are other things in the Spanish makeup that perhaps has been overlooked. They were not all enslavers or killers of the Indians or such things. They did have among them a lot of advocates for kind treatment that when they met Indians, not just to consider them as people who needed to be done away with. Now, let me talk about some other group which perhaps you wouldn't even think to find in this area, and that is the Jews. Now, this is the area of in 1590. You'll notice that there are no settlements in Texas. The settlements were all to the southwest of the Rio Grande. They were in Nuevo Leon and down over all the way to Mexico. This is the place that they were trying to settle first. Caspar Castaño, which has my grandmother's name, but I've never been able to prove a link, led the first group of Spanish settlers up the Pecos River in 1590, but it ended badly. Let's talk about him. Captain Castaño had been the second in command in the new settlements of Nuevo Leon. When the governor, Luis de Carval, was arrested as a Jew who had publicly converted to Christianity but still practiced Judaism secretly. This was called a converso. He was arrested and taken away to Mexico City, and his relatives were burned at the stake. He himself died before he suffered that fate. He always said that he was not a converso Jew. Anyway, Caspar Castaño and a group of settlers who had been settled in that area suddenly became frightened and decided to go north, where there were no settlements of Spanish people. So in July 1590, he left from Almaden with about 160 to 170 people. It's right under the O of Nuevo Leon. Can you see Nuevo Leon there? Right under the O is Almaden. He left from there, and he proceeded to travel northwards along the Rio Grande until he got to the Pecos River, and then he went north from there. from his journal, and this is his journal, of course, he took a scribe with him so that he could say exactly which direction he went. He wrote it all down. He had the scribe write it all down. And you can find this. It's called A Colony on the Move. And it's his account of what he did, the scribe's account. And this has been mapped, if you can see on the over there at the top, by satellites. They've gone through there and gone through his journal and then mapped his route. All right, what happened to these people was, as soon as the authorities in Mexico City knew that Castaño had taken a group of settlers and was going up to the north, they sent someone after him, led by the Inquisition. They caught up with him near the Pecos River. They took him back in chains to Mexico. His group was ordered all the way back. They said they had no permission to go north. You had to have permission for everything. You had to have even a permission to go into the wilderness. So they were taken back. The settlers later found another few other towns in northern Mexico. Castaño himself was taken down to Mexico. He was imprisoned. They couldn't decide whether he was Jewish or not, or if he'd had any connection with the Jews. They sent him to the Philippines, and he was killed there when there was an insurrection of slaves. His family went to the authorities in Spain and had a trial. He was dead, but they needed to clear his name. Now, why did they have to clear his name? If there was any suspicion that you were Jewish or that you were Muslim, you could not go to the New World. You could not go to New Spain. You had to have a paper, which was called purity of blood, that showed that you had no ancestors who were Jewish or that they were Moroccan, not Moroccan, but Muslim, or Moors, as they used to call them. Of course, this didn't stop a lot of people. All they did was get false papers, get on the boat, and come anyway. All right, let's go to some customs that are very important for you to understand if you're trying to look at Spanish records. The first custom is the naming convention. The first names are given at christening by the priest. That's why they're called given names, because they are given. These can be multiple names. There's usually a saint's name. The examples are like Alonso, which you've already met, and it's Germanic, ready for battle. Andres, Greek, manly. It is a saint's name from St. Andrew, of course. Alvar, Germanic, army of elves. Now, why would you have so many Germanic names there? That's because they became very popular. The ones who reconquered Spain from the Moors were Germanic origin. They were Goths. They were the ones who led the reconquest, and they finally threw the Moors out of Spain. Because of this long conquest, which, as you know, lasted until 1492, just before America was conquered, or Columbus came, not conquered, the people started to be very careful that they did not have a name from the Old Testament. There was no Jacobs. There was no Gaspar. If you know who Gaspar was, one of the wise men. So they tried to avoid all names which came from the Old Testament, which might show that you were Jewish or Muslim. Now, slaves, for example, Estevan or Estevanico, and Indians only had one name. That was the one given to them by the priest when they were christened. They had no surnames until the middle of the 19th century. If they were converts, the former name was usually not given on their christening records. So if you know that you have Indian ancestry or slave ancestry, before the middle of the 19th century, you will not be able to find their names in the church records for christening. The Spanish surnames were based on the Roman patronymic system for surnames, and this was used until the Middle Ages in Spain. That is, you used EZ, ES, or IZ at the end of your father's name. For example, Nunez was son of Nuno. This is like John, Johnson, Steve, Stevenson. The same pattern applied in Spain. Thereafter, the patronymic names became used as family names and did not change every generation. After a time, you came just like you did in England, where Johnson, the son of Johnson, became Johnson. He didn't become another name like Thompson. Do you see? You know how patronymic names work? You're named after your father, and you just add something at the end to make sure that you know that that you are the son of this person. It only worked when you lived in a small village. Now, also family names might add a place name. For example, you have Andres Dorantes de Carranza. It means that Andres was the son of Durant from Carranza, which is a town in the Basque Country in northern Spain. Now, starting in the 16th century, there was double surname. The first surname is from the father's family, and the second is from the mother's family. For example, Alonso Castillo, which was his father's surname, Maldonado, which was his mother's surname. So you will see a double name there. The mother's maiden name is known from her children's surnames. As soon as you find the name of the child, you will know the maiden name of the mother. You don't have to go through this horrible problem that all Anglos have to go through, where the woman is only known by the name of her husband, and you can't find out who her father was. In Spanish, you don't have that problem because the name of the mother is always known. She keeps it until her death. Now, there were other surname patterns. You could, up until the 19th century, choose other surnames from the family heritage from which you came, instead of the father's. For example, Alvar Cabeza de Vaca chose his mother's surnames, Nunez, Cabeza de Vaca, instead of his father's name, which was Vega. Why did he do that? It was because Cabeza de Vaca was, that particular surname was more prestigious than his father's. And you could do that if you wanted to, up until mostly into the 19th century. The name Cabeza de Vaca, which means the cow's head, was supposedly given in the 13th century to a shepherd who put a cow's skull on the entrance to a mountain pass as a sign for the Spanish soldiers who were able to defeat the Moors by going through that pass and going around the Moorish forces. However, there is a 3-volume work, 3 volumes, called Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, his account, his life and expedition, that found that there was no basis for this story. They did, in that 3-volume work, a complete workup of all his family, going back, I think, 15 generations from the 1500s. So you can imagine how much that they found to see what that they decided that Cabeza de Vaca was not the name given because some ancestor of his put a skull somewhere. There had to be another reason. Now, the next custom, which is very strange and unusual, was the Casta system. Now, this is an artificial order depicting different mixtures of 3 races, European, African, and American Indian, used in Spanish documents in New Spain until 1821. Now, this was peculiar only to the people in New Spain in the Spanish system. It was a division of people by racial mixture. All possible combinations of Spanish, African, and American Indian offspring were classified and named. According to the system, there were 3 pure races, that is the Spanish, the African, and the American Indian. Mixed offspring were called Casta, which comes the same word that you know from the South Asian Indians who have caste. It is the same idea, Casta. And the categories each had unique names. All Spanish presumed to be free of Jewish or Moorish blood. Some categories were named for animals like lobo, which is wolf, mulatto, which is mule, and some were named for other ethnic groups like Morisco, which is Moor, or Chino, which is Chinese. Some were fanciful like up in the air or turned around. They had all sorts of names for different mixtures of the Casta. They even had Casta paintings. Now these were souvenirs which people from Spain, when they came to Mexico, would buy. They came in a card set like this, and they would show a man and a woman and a child, each from a different casta, plus the Spanish, of course. And then they would have the name all down there. You can see the whole set here. Some of these are very nice paintings. SMU has a small collection of them, and some of them are quite large. And because these were done by people who were actually Mexicans and lived in Mexico, they show a lot of humanity. They don't show it as a circus or as a freak show or anything like that. They show it as a family living together, whatever color they are, which shows you the difference here between what was the sensibility of the people in New Spain and what was the sensibility of the people in Spain. Now this is a simplified casta system here. The other one was, and this is the one that was used, and you will find in Texas documents. Okay, at the top, I'll try to show you how this works. I've put them so that you can see. If an African, for example, married or had a child by a Spaniard, the result was a mulatto. If the Spaniard, who was peninsular, that is, he came from Spain, married a Spaniard who was from from Spain also, their child, if born in Mexico, was called a Creole. They're Spanish, they're full-blood Spanish, but they were called Creoles. Creoles were not allowed to go into the highest government positions, the highest army positions, or the highest church positions. They were somehow presumably tainted by being not born in Mexico. I mean, not born in Spain, that they were born in Mexico. It's strange, but that's what they did. Now, if a Spaniard of any type married an American Indian, they were mestizo, or mestiza, if you're a woman. If a mestiza married a Creole, it became, the person was a castizo. Now, castizo is just one step below a Spaniard. And if you married a full-blooded Spaniard, then you would be a Spaniard. But you would be, of course, a Creole. All right? Now, if the American Indian married an African, then their child would be a Lobo. If a Lobo married a Mestiza, the child would be a Coyote, from coyote, of course. Now, in Texas, Castizo and Coyote were synonymous for some reason. So when you're talking about a Coyote, you don't know exactly what, in Texas, what they actually meant by that. Now, in many, you have to watch this, in many transcriptions of Spanish documents, transcriptions, that means somebody has read the original Spanish and then has either translated or just written it down so that you can read it, not in the handwriting. They have, unfortunately, become politically correct, and they start omitting the references to the casta. Now, genealogical, this is a real problem for the researcher. because the Casta group assigned can often separate people of the same name living in the same town. In other words, if I know that this person belongs to this casta or that casta, I can be pretty sure that this is a different person. But if you take away the casta, it's one more clue that I don't have to figure this out. This system lasted until Mexico freed itself from Spain in 1821. Now let's look at the ethnic structure of Texas from 1777 to 1793. All right, you see the Spaniards here? They're all in red. Do you see the Indians? They're in brown. And then we have the mestizos, which are kind of a yellow color, well, dark yellow, and light yellow would be the other colors, and the blacks would be the Negroes. Now this is just before we had all the big Anglo-Saxon arrival. Now this is taken from the census figures of 1777 to 1793, where there was a census in Texas at that time. Now you'll notice that the Spaniards make up from 40 to 55% of the total population. However, soldiers and wealthy individuals were counted as Spanish. All soldiers who were at the fort, the Presidio, were counted as Spaniards. They probably weren't. Probably a lot of them were mestizo, but they counted them as Spaniards. If you were wealthy enough and looked, it was a social thing. If you looked like you were wealthy, you could be counted as a Spaniard too. I don't care how dark you were. Now, it's known about Ybarra. Ybarra was the founder of Nacogdoches. He's always, in all the documents, named Spanish. He was, in fact, mulatto. His mother was an African, a slave, who was brought from Louisiana. But he was the founder of Nacogdoches. He was a bureaucrat. He was the governor of that, mayor of that city for a very long time. No one ever called him anything except Spanish, and that's how you find him on the records. Now, I have a strange thing about one of my ancestors who was in Nacogdoches, and on the census, he is counted as a coyote, which means, in this particular case, that he was light brown. His mother was Spanish. His father was French. Now how could this be? Well, the census taker or the priest or the government official who went around putting these names on records took into account how they were dressed. And if you had been out in the sun and you were kind of brown from sun, I don't care what color you were naturally, they would put you down as a lower caste, just because you were brown and not well dressed. So when you see the casta system here, don't think that it was written in stone, because it wasn't. They just looked at you and made a snap decision what they thought you looked like. Now look at the Indians. The Indians come out to be not very many, 30%, sometimes 20%. Indians were not counted usually in the census because they did not live in the towns. They lived in the missions. They came over there to work, and then they left and they went back to their villages. So Indians living in the towns or in the missions were less than you would expect at this particular time. Although, of course, a lot of them had died, had moved away, or whatever by the late 1700s. The mestizos and the other coloreds come to about 20 to 30%, and this is most probably right, but don't forget that the mestizo and the colored population, or whatever they were called, might have some Europeans in there too. The blacks were never more than 3% of the population, and this is because slave labor agriculture was not prevalent in Texas. And many of the blacks who were in Texas at the time were escaped escapees from Louisiana, which did have black slaves. Now, the total population for all of Texas was about 3,000. Not very many. Anyway, we're ahead of our story. Let's go back a bit. Here come the French. All right, let's talk about the French. The French also had a very big influence. In 1682, the French explorer La Salle went down the Mississippi and went all the way down to what is now New Orleans. He discovered the mouth of the Mississippi. He knew what he had found. He knew that he had found the sea and that it led to Mexico. He knew that. He went back up the Mississippi and he went to France. Within 2 years, he had got money together and he came back with a group of settlers, and they were going to set up right there in New Orleans and start the port so that they could, of course, cash in on the trade between Spain and Mexico. As you remember, the pirates and the golden doubloons, et cetera, and how they all would go and capture it, and the English would try to capture the golden ships, etc. Well, he saw a perfect opportunity. So he came back. Unfortunately, he missed the New Orleans port, which wasn't a port, of course. It was just the mouth of the Mississippi, and went further on to what is now Houston. He went inside a bit to get away from the bad effects of Houston weather, and he formed a colony, which he called St. Louis, near Garcetas Creek, which is in Victoria County in Texas. Now, he set out 3 times from there trying to find the French, wherever the French were, trying to find the Mississippi so he could go back so that he could get help for these people. 3 times. Finally, on the 3rd time, his own men killed him in 1987. Well, they were near the East Texas settlement of the Caddos. This is a picture which is supposed to show the Caddo village near where he was killed. And so off they go. The Spanish, of course, had heard rumors from the Indians that the French colony had been established in Texas, and they ordered General Alonso de Leon, a Spaniard born in northern Mexico, to investigate it. He made 5 expeditions into Texas, and these, the lines over here from northern Mexico, show you where he went. 5 times he went trying to find the French. Finally, in 1680, he found the remains of the fort and the bodies, or the bones actually, of the colonists who were found, along with the cannons. They buried them. He also recovered 5 French children who had been spared and were living with the Indians. And he named many of the rivers which went down from Texas to the Gulf, including the Trinity. He established, not established, because this was a road well known by the Indians, and all he did was follow an Indian trail. But he marked the way of what became the Camino Real, or the Royal Road, leading from Mexico City all the way up to the Louisiana, what would be the Louisiana border. And he said that they should do missions and forts to protect us, to protect Mexico from the French invasion. Now, did they go? Did they actually leave? Actually, they didn't. From the Mississippi, the French established certain bases out off the Mississippi tributaries, and they would come into Texas and trade with the Indians. And here you can see the happy Frenchmen trading with the Indians. This was all done without the Spanish knowing it, because they couldn't keep anyone in Texas long enough. Now, what did the French trade? The French traded guns, knives, metal objects, and you would be surprised to learn that they also traded clothing, especially good clothing, embroidery, and beads, and such things with the Indians. And what did they get back? Of course, they got back pelts and furs from the Indians, which were very, very expensive in France. Now, this trade was forbidden by the Spanish. And this did not stop the most famous Frenchman of the time, Saint-Denis, from traveling from the new post, which was just on the Louisiana area, which is called Natchitoches, to the Spanish fort on the Rio Grande in 1714 to break the embargo. Now, he was promptly arrested, he was sent to Mexico City, but he escaped and returned to the Rio Grande, where he married the granddaughter or the relative of the commandant of the Spanish post. It seems that under the cover of Catholic religion, because that's why he said he came, that the Indians needed to have Catholic priests there, and he could offer French priests for the conversion of the Texas Indians. They were actually they were taking a route of making a runaround for a smuggling route. They were going to smuggle things between Mexico and France. Here's the Camino Real. You can see it up here. It had different roads. It wasn't one road, as you can see, going through Texas. What did it connect? It connected Mexico City, which was the most wealthiest city in all of the Americas. They had silver, gold, all sorts of things in Mexico City. And when New Orleans was established in 1720, they started to go around. Now, why did they have to go around? The Spanish made only one port in Mexico available for trade, and that was Veracruz. No other ports were allowed, not in Texas and not lower than Veracruz. Veracruz was the only port that was allowed for any trade, and the French were barred from going to Veracruz. Now, what did they give to the, what did they trade? Well, the French, of course, traded what they usually trade, which is good-looking clothing and French wine. And what did the Mexicans trade, or what did the Texans exactly trade them? And by what means? Well, they went by mule train. And it was called, and I heard one time a lecturer call it, it was the Walmart on hooves. Because everything that you wanted was on that mule train. You just had to stop the mule train and see what they had and bargain with them. Now, what did the Spanish trade? Specifically, what did the Texans trade? Because all they did was trade things and then bring them in. They traded cattle. They had set up a cattle ranching in all of South Texas, all the way up until the middle of Texas. These are the longhorn cattle, and about 30,000 cows, longhorn steers, whatever they were, 20,000 steers, were driven to Louisiana every year. 20,000 were driven for most of the 18th century. Because in Louisiana, the cows and actually the horses died. You could not get them to stand the mosquitoes and the heat. They liked Texas, but they didn't like Louisiana. They also got the wild horses, the Mustangs from the Texas plains, which were very much in demand. And this brought trouble because they started bringing Anglo-American smugglers in who tried to grab some horses and run across without going through middlemen. And this is the famous Philip Nolan, who was caught by the Mexican authorities and more or less executed. He was killed by them. Now, what they mostly wanted was hard currency. This is what they were missing in New Orleans. They needed hard currency. They had the silver pesos, and this was the pieces of 8, which would be loved by the pirates. You took a Spanish peso and you cut it into 8 parts, and then you could use 1/8 of it to buy small items. So these were the pieces of 8. It was not the doubloons, which were gold. It was the pesos, which were silver. Right. Now let's look at the colonization methods used by the Spanish. They followed certain procedures in New Spain, and they again used them in Texas. In this ideal system, and I'm showing you the ideal system, there were 3 interlocking circles. The first arm was the mission, which was the religious organizations, with perhaps a fort, which was the presidio, for protection. After that, they would have a civilian settlement come into the pacified areas. The mission was to pacify the Indians. It was to try to get them to become good Christians and become agriculturalists. They didn't exactly manage to convert most of them. The military presidio was there to protect the priests. If it happened that they managed to form a calm area, then they could bring in the civilian settlements. The most well-known, of course, and the one which became most famous was San Antonio, but there were others. There was one in Goliad, and there was Nacogdoches. Now, Nacogdoches was formally established in 1779 on an abandoned mission site, and there were former soldiers there from an old fort. The various missions and presidios were centered around San Antonio, as I said, Bahia, which was in Goliad, and they gradually evolved into civilian settlements. Only the Spanish settlements next to the Rio Grande were settled by 1750, and these were settled by a man called Escandron, who settled a lot of Mexican families on that, along the what became the Mexican-Texas border, along the Rio Grande and the Nueces. Now these 3 branches, these are all based on a Roman civil code and the model. And the regulations that they had for governing all the civil government, they govern the modern municipalities all the way from Texas to California. That is why the Southwest has a slightly different system of government than the one that you find in the areas of New England or in the Midwest. It's because of the Spanish influence and the laws. There are several books about the laws of Texas and how they were influenced by the Spanish. I think I've given you several on the handout. All right, now we're finally going to get to the documents which were made by this system. The well-known one are the Bear Archives, and this is a document from 1742, and it shows the Spanish document and the translation. And this is a website which is the Bear Archives Online, and it's from the University of Texas at Austin, and they are the custodians of the Spanish and Mexican government documents concerning the San Antonio area, but they have a lot of material for Nacogdoches and Goliad. And I've given you, I think, in the handout, the website for this. You should go to it. It is unbelievable. They have they have an index for it, and you can find almost anything. If you think that your ancestors were from the San Antonio area or with the Spanish, you'll be able to find it. This particular document I'm showing you here is 1742, and it shows the brand that you used on your cattle and your horses, and it was a registry for that brand. They registered the brand so that people would know who this brand belonged to. Now, if you're interested in livestock brands or cowboys or anything like that, I suggest that you get the Jack Jackson's book. Jack Jackson has written a book. It is 704 pages. It is exhaustive, and it exhausts you when you read it, but he's a very entertaining writer, or he was. He's now deceased. His book is also on the handout. You might be surprised to find out that the Texas cowboy has his roots in Moorish Spain. This is the Nacogdoches census of 1809. Now, if any of you have ever worked with census records, especially American Anglo census records, you would find that they don't tell you much except the head of the family and how many children he had or how many slaves he had or whatever. Now, this is a census from 1809, and they record a great range of information, especially when compared to American or European censuses of the same time. In this example, the categories include the names of all the people in the household, their relationship, their birthplace, their age, their marital status, their occupation, the place of origin, the date of the arrival, their residence, and a complete description of their possessions and by whose permission they reside on this piece of land. Now, the highlighted family right up there in yellow is my collateral ancestor, Ramon Chavana. He was born in Lampasas in Nuevo Leon. He was age 40. He's married. He's a farmer. He came from Lampasas to Nacogdoches in 1793. He lives with his wife and 5 children in his father-in-law's log house. The dimensions are given for this house. He owns 12 cows, 3 oxen, 4 mares, and cultivates a ranch named El Moral, formerly owned by his father-in-law, but sold to an absentee landowner. In other households, if you go down, you will find some black slaves and Indians with only their first name given. One of the slaves is named Louisa. She's 41. She's married. She's listed as coming from Guinea in 1772. This is actually an unusual listing because the slaves were mostly brought by the later Anglo-American settlers. But there were a few in Nacogdoches that were purchased by some of the local families, mostly as house servants from Louisiana, and they were brought over there. As you can imagine, on this frontier area, the laws of the land were not always observed. Now, these 2 documents, the top one comes from the Residents of Texas. The book is called The Residents of Texas. It's all, just as I have showed you here, translated, typed out. You can find this book in almost any genealogical library in Texas, called Resident of Texas, 3 volumes. Below is the original documents on microfilm. These are called Translations of Statistical and Census Reports of Texas and Sources Documenting the Black in Texas. And this is a microfilm reel. I think there's 2 of them. Not all libraries have them, and I don't know if Fort Worth has it. I know that Dallas does, and it's in the Texas section, not in the genealogy section. I have used the microfilm because sometimes you need to check something. I used it to check one of the names of Ramon's sons because the way that it was written in English, I thought that it was wrong. I went down and found it in the original Spanish, and I found that it was correct. It was just an unusual name. When you're looking for sources, always try to go back to the original if you can. Don't settle for the transcriptions or the translations if you can take it. However, there are exceptions to this rule. Now, in Texas, there are church records for San Antonio, and there are church records for Goliad and church records for Nuevo Laredo and for El Paso. You can find all of these in Spanish, and they are on microfilm, or some of them are even digitized, and you can find them online. Nacogdoches lost all of its church records in the big problems that they had between the Anglos and the Spanish coming there, and some political problems between the original settlers and the Mexican or Spanish government. Many times Nacogdoches was abandoned, and finally the church itself was destroyed, and even the graveyard has been covered over, and if you go to Nacogdoches now, you will not find any signs of the original town. Now this is, so what did you do if you couldn't find a priest and you wanted to get married? Baptism was okay. In an emergency, any practicing Christian could baptize an infant. But what could you do about a marriage contract? There was no priest available. So what did they do? They would do a civil contract between the two parties. They would go before the governor and the mayor, and he would write up a paper. Now this particular one here is a transcription. I haven't given you the original. And this is, the originals are very difficult to find. They are in what is called the Nacogdoches archives and in the Texas State Library. And in the Texas State Library, they have microfilmed them all. They have tried to put them in order. There is not a good index. If you're looking for a particular person, you're not going to be able to find them by going through those pages and pages of documents. It's just not going to be possible. However, there was a man, his name was Robert Bruce Blake, who, for reasons of his own, he was a court reporter in Nacogdoches, got very interested in the early Nacogdoches history. And at that time, the records were there, available in Nacogdoches. It's before they transferred all of them to Austin. And he went and read them. And he transliterated some of them. Transliteration is what you've got here. He typed them up by a manual typewriter in Spanish, but so that you could read it. Some of them he translated. This is a transliteration of a marriage document, a transcription. It's a transcription if we like. Between John Norris and Marie Celeste Stockman. It's signed on the 6th of November, 1826. The judge presiding is Samuel Norris, the brother of the groom, and the official clerk is Antonio Sepulveda. The witnesses are San Diego, that means James Gaines, a brother-in-law of the Norrises and a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence. Jose Marie Chavana, the brother-in-law of the clerk, and also the son of my ancestor. Contracts of this type didn't have any set form, but they just had the declared intention that these people would intend to marry in a church as soon as they could get to the church, when there was an opportunity to do that. Unusually in this particular one, Miss Stockton doesn't have any relatives of her own as witnesses. Now, Stephen F. Austin also used the same contract in his colony, and they were considered legal contracts. The names of in this transcription of the bride and groom are put into the Spanish equivalents. For example, it is Juan Norris and Maria Celeste Estocoman from Stockman. It's, in other words, when this was a Spanish document, so it had kind of moved the English names over to what they could say or what they could pronounce. This leads to a very strange problem. Now, you have three types of records dealing with Nacogdoches. English records, which were done after Texas became a republic. Spanish records, which were those dealing before that time. And French records, because Nacogdoches, as I said, was many times destroyed for various reasons, and all the population moved to across the border to Louisiana, and they were all there in the church records in French. So what happens if you have a person there? How do you find him? Well, you have to use a little imagination. Okay, let's try my person, who was Chavano, or sometimes Chirano, because the person couldn't read the writing correctly. Serrano is another person, another family completely. In Spanish, the original was Saban, which changed to Chavana. What was the original in French? Because it was a French name. It was Chavan or Chaval. It was the original French name. The man who was the original holder of this name was French and came in to Mexico in 1760. Married a woman from a very good family. The Leon family had a lot of land there. And when she died, he married someone from the Perez family who had the other big piece of land. So we're asking, why did this French guy, who was probably just a soldier, as far as I can tell from his records, he was a soldier, and he went all the way down there. He was one time was arrested by the Spanish authorities, but he got out because he'd already got married, he had children. What was he doing over there? Well, let's go back and think about it. He didn't come over there because he was a soldier. He'd run away from being a soldier. He said he had run away. He had deserted the French army. But why would he come all the way down to Mexico? Don't forget the smuggler's route. People made money bringing things from one area to another area. One of the things they liked to bring was horses. The best horses were actually from Lampasas. The people who were running the smuggling operation in Nacogdoches had family in Lampasas. They were the ones who sent their agents down to bring however many horses you needed up. Now, these horses were not Mustangs. These horses were bred, usually quarter horses of Arabian stock. And they would bring them up. They fetched more money than you can imagine at the time in New Orleans. And they were shipped even up to New England. One reason that Texas was taken over was because of this horse need by the Americans. They loved these horses. Even Thomas Jefferson had seen one and wanted one. Now, let's go back to the names. Okay, now the wife of the Chavano who moved to Nacogdoches was named Maria Josefa Sanchez. Now, if you go to the English census taken just after they started taking the census in Texas in 1850, you come out with this name, Chapat Census. I looked at this, I must have gone through that census record probably 20 times before I finally figured out that this was her. And I knew she had to be there, but I couldn't find her name. Chapat must have been some sort of nickname. There's often a nickname given to people, and when they ask, who is this, they'll come out with a nickname. My grandmother's name was also Josefa. She was known as Pepa. And I found a letter written about Pepa, and I didn't know who that was, because I had never heard her called that, but I later found out that that's what their nickname was. So you have to be very careful here. What were the nicknames of these people? How could you have changed it to come into one record or another? Then we have Julianne Norris and Nathaniel Norris, and she becomes, of course, Maria Juliana Norris, and he becomes Nathaniel Norris. But in French, you see that it becomes Norver, and Nathaniel becomes Norris. So you can, trying to find these names in different records is not easy. The one I like the best is William Quirk. As you will see, his name has completely changed in Spanish, and then completely changed again in French. But if you read it, Guillermo, of course, it means William in Spanish, and Quirca is what you would probably come out with in Spanish. And the same, Bella, it's probably sometimes somebody called him Billy, and it was Billy Quirk. And his wife, Mary Louise Quirk, you can see how they changed her name. And then we have Jane Portier, who was actually French from Louisiana, and this is how her name was spelled in French, and this is how it was spelled in Spanish. So one of the things that is very important is to try to figure out your languages. Okay, let's go on to land. And these are the ranchos of Nacogdoches in 1810. This map is not to scale, but it's trying to give you an idea of the land grants in Texas. They're crowded on the western edge of the Camino Real on this side. On the other side, you can see the two big pieces of land. That's the Sabine River, which would later be the difference between Louisiana and Mexico and Texas. Now, these were usually surveyed in what were 4-league plots. However, you can see that Barr, which is number, I think, 33 and 32, Davenport and Barr were the big American traders who came over there, the commercial agents, and they were allowed into Texas by the Mexican government. I think that they paid a lot of bribes to get this designation. They put two great big pieces of land over there just across from the Louisiana border. Now, they weren't farmers, they were traders. What do you think that they had on that land? Horses, cows, whatever. It was a staging post. And they had two great big staging posts right there, right across the Louisiana border, so that they could have some place to keep their stuff. The Spanish authorities could not go over there. Now, Barr also bought number 2, which is right over here on this side, so that he could greet any things that came through there, any mule trains that came through there, or not him himself, of course. He had a lot of agents who worked for him, including 2 of the 2 brothers who were descendants of my ancestor. They both worked for him, and I know that from the records. Number 22, if you can see it at the top, you see 24 and 22. 22 is the Norris land. I want you to look at that because I'm going to talk about them in just a minute. Number 11, 4, and 8, 11, 4, and 8 in the middle and not in squares. This is the Chavana Sanchez land from the original. It's along a river, a creek, so the land is not square. Now let's talk about how do you do a 4-league land plot. All right. Now we're talking Spanish, and that most of the land was given out in 4-league plots. Most of you who have done any work over here know that it was usually a league and a labor is what the plots were. 1 league, 1 labor. The surveys were carried out by 2 horsemen. They would use a 500 vara rope. The rope, a vara, was 33 inches, like that. They would pick a central point, usually a house or a prominent landmark, and start measuring out from there on each of the cardinal points, going out 5,000 varas, making 1 league, which would equal 100 tosses of the rope from one horseman to another. Okay, do you see where the little red cross is in the middle? Let's say that is your landmark, or a house that you've built there, or a big stone, or a big tree, whatever. You have the landmark there. You have 2 people come out on horses. They are your surveyors. They have a rope, a certain length. They start off, and usually they run this. They would start galloping off with the rope held in one hand by the one guy standing straight, still, and the other galloping off. When he got to the end of the rope, he stopped. Then the other one would take that rope and gallop past the first one until he had to stop, and then they would gather the other one. You had to do this 100 times, all right, to reach the point. And which direction are you going? You're going according to the compass. Okay, so they had a compass with them. They had a rope. They had 2 men on horses. This is their survey team. Okay, so they would go south all the way down there. They would put a stone. They would go back to the center. They would go east, if you like, put a stone. They would come back. They would go west. They would put a stone. They would go north, and they would put a stone. Now, then they would square it off. In other words, your plot of land is not diamond-shaped going north and south. Do you see? It's not that way. It's bigger than what we're talking about. All right, so you have 1 league from the center to the south, the west, the east, and the north. But it's more than 1 league if you were going to the corners, isn't it? Do you see the mathematics of it? No? Okay. Now, this would all be done by the government official. And after it was done, they went back over there, the government official would come out, he would write it all down, he would have the surveyor who were on the horses mark the paper saying that they were the ones who had done the survey. I had one of my ancestors, who was actually kind of old, I don't know how he did this, was surveying this land. And he actually surveyed the Norris land, which I'll show about in a minute. Now, how much land is this? All right, if you have 1 league equals 2.6 miles, that's north-south, and east-west would be 5.2 miles. How many square miles does a 4-league piece of land encompass? The answer is 27.04 square miles. It is a big piece of land. All right, now this is a Mexican land grant. This is for my ancestor, Ramon Chavana, and this one is available on the Texas General Land Office site. It is all in Spanish, and you can see the date, 1834 to 1835, just before the Mexican Revolution. I mean, just before the Texas Revolution. Why would they be doing this just before the Texas Revolution? Most of the Texas land grants, the Spanish ones, were not finalized at the provincial capitals. They had to be taken to the provincial capital. All that paperwork that they did had to be taken to the provincial capital, and it had to be finalized there. Then they would send the finalized paper back to you. Now, of course, at that time, most of the frontier ranchers, they couldn't afford to take time off and go down there. They wouldn't accept an agent. You really had to go down there and do it yourself. I don't know if you've heard about the Fredonian rebellion in Nacogdoches in 1826 and 27. This was caused because the Mexican government sent in an impresario, which they had granted a contract to Hayden Edwards to bring in settlers to Nacogdoches area. They wanted to have, like Stephen F. Austin. Now, the trouble with Nacogdoches, unlike the area that Austin had a lot of people there, as I just showed you. There were a lot of people who lived there. They made their living somewhat by farming, mostly by illegal trade. All right, but they owned their land. It had been given to them by the Spanish government, but they didn't have final deeds. Most of them didn't have final deeds. So when Hayden came in there, Hayden Edwards, he came into the Nacogdoches area. He started asking everyone where was their deed. Of course, they didn't have the deeds. It had all been promised. They maybe had done the whole paper. The papers hadn't been sent in, or if they'd been sent in, they didn't get them back. This made everybody mad. And so the old settlers asked for the Mexican government to throw Edwards out. The Mexican government agreed. Edwards went and found his group, and they came and arrested Samuel Norris, who was the mayor at the time, and his associate, which was Sepulveda. So the Mexican army started to move in. They freed the Samuel Norris and the other people who were with him, and they established order again, and they threw Hayden Edwards out. However, still by 1834, they still didn't have their claims to their land. There were a group of land speculators who went around. The land claims were made through land speculators. They came in, went to all the old settlers, said, we will do your surveying for you all by the modern means. We will take the papers to the provincial capital. We will get you the papers. In return, you give us part of this land. They agreed. And you won't find the agreement. The agreement was oral between the landowner and the person who was backing this. But if you check the deeds, you will see that in fact, just shortly afterwards, they sold a large section to the speculators. So this is why you have a lot of deeds done in 1834 and 35. They were done by the old settlers there who wanted to keep their land, and they knew which way the wind was blowing. They knew that there was going to be a revolution, and they knew that the Mexican government was going to lose. All right, now what happened to those poor people who didn't do this? Let's go back to Samuel Norris. His father was Edmund Norris. He had come into Nacogdoches in 1806. He was from New England. He had lived there all his life. He died there. His sons were all born, not all his sons, but most of his sons lived there, and their children were all born in that area on this 4-league plot that he had. All right. After his father died, he could never get this settled. He didn't go with the rest of them who went with the land speculators. He could not get his sites done. So his son took the court case to the Texas Supreme Court. And in 1878, John Norris, the son of Edmund, received 640 acres. 640 acres is about 1 league. He didn't get the 4 leagues. And he only got that because they considered it a homestead, because he could prove that he'd been there all those years, so it was a homestead. But he didn't get his original. All right, let's talk about something else besides land, just a minute. This is the social life, and this is the famous fantango dances that they used to hold in all the settlements. Very, very well known. All the Anglo settlers who came through there talked about the fandango dances and how much fun they were. They had big halls and sometimes just a floor that they would make under the trees or out in the open air so that everyone could dance. This one shows you they're shooting guns and drinking and doing all sorts of things there besides dancing. All right, then of course they would bury the dead. That's what you have over here with the procession. They would go to church to get married. They would make tortillas. Let me show you the Chavana Grant as it appears today. This is in Nacogdoches. The first in the top you will see the house. The house is almost where that log cabin was built in 1806. Almost, not quite. Down at the bottom you'll see a trail or a very small road going through the grant. Over here on your right is the Camino Real. It goes right in front of that house, just as it shows on the grant land and on the census where it is. If you go straight down that little road, at the end of that road is what's called the Morale Settlement. And it's settlement. You find the church, you find a clearing in front of the church, you'll find the houses around that clearing. This is the oldest. You would have the plaza in the middle of any settlement. It was for market day, it was for big meetings, dances. What did you want to hold? They were in that place. Here they had to clear the forest to get that. They have a cemetery. Down at the bottom you will see the gravestone of Tom Montez. Tom was the great-great-grandson of the original owner. And the other one is Martin Gonzalez. He was the grandson of the original owner. The Chavanas as a surname did not last in Texas at that time, not the original one here. There are a lot of Chavanas, you can find them all over Texas. They came a little bit later. They are all from the same family. If you ever come across anybody named Chavana, most probably he is from that first French man who escaped from the French army and went down to Mexico. This is the Morale Creek, which is the western boundary on the Chavana Grant. and life goes on. Thank you very much.